Welcome to our first spring Women's Leadership Forum titled Salary Negotiation for Women, the latest research and cutting-edge best practices. I'm Dr. Susan Madsen, founding director of the Utah Women in Leadership Project, and also the Karen Haight Huntsman Endowed Professor of Leadership in the John M. Huntsman School of Business at Utah State University. And I'm the host and will be the panel moderator today. This event furthers the mission of the Utah Women in Leadership Project, which is to strengthen the impact of Utah girls and women. And we serve Utah and its residents by first, producing relevant, trustworthy, and applicable research, and second, creating and gathering valuable resources, and third, convening trainings and events that inform, inspire, and ignite growth for all Utahns, just like this one today. I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Utah Education Network, UEN, the John M. Huntsman School of Business, and USU Extension for making this event possible. I've been looking forward to this panel so that I can learn. I've studied research through the years, but bringing in some of the researchers nationally and globally that really know and study this often has been really exciting for me. So what I'm going to do is just do some introductions, but I'm going to do one at a time and then ask each of them a question so I don't read too many bios all at the same time. So Hannah Riley Bowles is the Roy E. Larson Senior Lecturer in Public Policy and Management at Harvard Kennedy School. Hannah chairs the school's Management, Leadership, and Decision Science area and co-directs the Center for Public Leadership and the Women and Public Policy program. With over 25 years of experience, she is a leading expert on gender and negotiation. Her research focuses on women's leadership advancement and the role of negotiation in educational and career advancement, including the management of work-family conflict. She's been featured in academic publications and major news media. And Professor Bowles is the faculty director of Women in Power and Women Leading Change and the executive programs for women in senior leadership. She has a doctorate of business administration from Harvard Business School, a master's of public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School, and a bachelor's from Smith College. Welcome so much, Hannah. I would love to have you just take a minute and talk about why are you so interested and passionate about the topic of salary negotiation for women, and why is it so important to study? You're on mute. Yeah.
Muted myself. Forgive me.
There you go.
There I am. All right. So thank you so much for having this conversation. I think it's a really important conversation. I'll say that I started out with a passion for negotiation. I think it's one of the most fundamental social processes. You know, we negotiate at work, we negotiate at home, with our friends, with our roommates. And the thing about salary negotiations that has been really important is, one, to look at it as a space where we do have agency. We have the potential to self-advocate, but also I've been really motivated to look at this research because it's also an area that has illuminated some of the barriers that constrain our behavior and some of the kind of social expectations that motivate actually men and women to behave differently in certain respects. And so salary negotiations is this wonderful opportunity, is this space where we can study opportunities, but then also constraints, and then strategize about how to get around them. And so, it's a fascinating journey that allows us to both do the really deep academic work, but then to go out and say things, God willing, that are useful to other people. So yeah, that's what kind of has brought me in.
That's fun, where you can actually see your research as an academic actually impacting people's lives, right? So I love that. Thank you for answering that. So second, let me introduce Julian Zlatev. He is an assistant professor of business administration at Harvard Business School in negotiation organizations and markets unit. He currently teaches the second year negotiation course. His research interests include ethics and morality, negotiations, decision-making, and pro-social behaviors such as charitable giving and volunteering. Another stream of work covers the ways in which individuals understand and employ nudge strategies such as the default effect to influence others. His work has been featured in academic publications, such as the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes, among others. He earned a PhD in Business Administration from Stanford University and a BA in Psychology from Northwestern University. Welcome. Would love to ask you the same question.
Thanks so much for having me and for organizing this. So for me, it sort of was similar, I guess, to Hannah in that I started out with sort of a real interest in negotiation and the sort of human processes and dynamics that come to play in negotiation settings. And as I was teaching the negotiation class for the MBA students, I was having a lot of conversations with these students who were sort of negotiating job offers and things like that for once they graduated. And something that I really noticed was that for many of the people that I was talking to, they found negotiation as a whole to be a pretty sort of stressful and anxiety-inducing experience. It's often something that you don't have a lot of sort of time to practice until it's sort of a real situation with your career on the line. And so there was sort of this base level of sort of stress in terms of how am I going to negotiate for my salary, for my job, for my career. And then I found that sort of the women that I was talking to that sort of were having these same sort of anxiety-inducing situations had this extra level of stress, knowing that there were sort of gender differences in this gender pay gap, gender biases and stereotypes and things like that. And so it was just this sort of added layer of stress on top of an already stressful situation. And what's interesting, I think, about this sort of type of situation is that the problem itself is pretty sort of clear and well-defined. There's been study after study showing things like a gender pay gap, gender differences in negotiation outcomes, but the problems themselves, or sorry, the causes themselves to this problem are complex and multifaceted. And I think there's been a lot of really good work sort of trying to understand the causes of this by sort of the other panelists on the Zoom call and others. And I think there's still also a sort of a lot to go. And so I think this is a really sort of rich space to do research. And like Hannah said, that can then sort of be brought to bear in terms of helping people negotiate better more generally.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us today. And Julia Baer is an associate professor in the College of Business at Stony Brook University. Her research focuses on gender and negotiation, as well as understanding gender gaps in organizations more broadly. Her research has been published in journals and books, including the Academy of Management Review, Academy of Management Journal, Journal of Applied Psychology, and Psychological Science. She has received multiple Best Paper Awards, as well as Fulbright and Marie Curie scholarships. She is the author of The Caring Ambition, which is what it is, and co-author of Why It Matters at Home and Work, forthcoming next month from Oxford University Press. She earned her PhD in organizational behavior from Carnegie Mellon University as well. To those listening in, you're welcome to put questions into the chat through Zoom in the presentation today, but also the Q&A. And we'll work those in. I'll help work those in, but panelists can answer them as well as we're moving through. And so we'll all be watching and include what we can today. So thank you so much again to all of you for joining today. So I would love to start us out. Julian, I'll start out with you. An article published by Harvard Business School in April of 2021. It talked about a study that you and your colleagues had published called Salary Negotiation, a Catch-22 for Women. Can you start us out and tell us more about this study and what you found?
Sure thing. Before that, I think there was a comment about Julie also explaining her interest and passion in the topic.
Oh, yes, Julia.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be. Oh, I think I froze.
Did I skip? I did. I skipped you.
Yes, no worries.
Thank you.
It's actually not, qualitatively different from what we've heard, but it is a pleasure to be here. And, I think one of the reasons why I'm fascinated about this topic is because on a macro level and a broad level, we do have persistent gender gap in pay. So we know, in the aggregate, women earn approximately 80% of what men earn. We see actually even really starker gaps when we look at career advancement. If we look at, let's say, among CEOs, the percentage of women is quite small. I think it's around 6% now, Fortune 500 companies. And so I think the research that we've been doing on gender negotiation is really a way to sort of understand these broader gender gaps, but on a more interpersonal level, and really trying to understand these processes and organizations. And really is fascinating research. I'll just a quick mention that when I first started researching this area almost 20 years ago, there was people knew very little bit about it, and people would ask me, what is your research about? And I would tell them, and they would give me this blank look, like I was speaking Chinese or speaking Greek. And today people are lecturing me about gender negotiation, like they're giving me lectures about, research that we've been doing for this time. So I think it's wonderful. I think there's a much, greater consciousness about these issues. I think people are aware of them. They're interested in them. I mean, certainly the fact that there are 305 participants on this panel speaks to that. But so I think it's a very exciting time to be doing this research. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And I did, for those listening in, I did give the three panelists a little detail about Utah in different ways. And one being our economy is crazy good in so many ways. We have such a low unemployment rate, which causes some problems, right? Because there's such a talent shortage. So I think this conversation actually comes at a really great time, because there's so many job openings right now that we as women can think about taking the risk and shifting companies or asking for raises. So Julian, back to you about your article that I introduced a few minutes ago.
Sure. So that article was based off of a study that was many years in the making. It actually started when my co-author and I, Jen Daniels, who's now at Dartmouth University, but when we were both graduate students at Stanford. And what we were looking to do is we were looking to try to disentangle some of the potential sort of causes for gender differences in negotiation outcomes that have been found in previous work by sort of Hannah and others. And there, in particular, there's been research on sort of two different reasons why this might be the case. One is this idea that women may be sort of negotiating less assertively in the negotiation itself, which could lead to worse negotiation outcomes. We call this sort of quote unquote the tameness account in our paper. And the other sort of potential reason is that men and women may be negotiating with the same level of assertiveness in these negotiation settings, but there may be sort of backlash toward women for negotiating just as assertively as maybe a man would in that situation. And so we call this the sort of backlash account. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to sort of take a look at whether we could try to disentangle these two different sort of reasons for the gender gap in negotiations that's been found. And what we're able to do is we were able to sort of use a data set from many, many years of students. These are MBA students, these are executives who are in executive education programs, these are managers. So a broad swath of people, both in the US, in Europe, in Asia, so across the world, who were engaging in these sort of negotiation exercises where they were taking on the role of either a job candidate or a recruiter who's trying to recruit that job candidate. And they would negotiate and then come to some sort of agreement or not in this negotiation exercise. And we had many years of data on how these sort of negotiations went for obviously for men and for women and for everyone who was negotiating these exercises. And we wanted to see whether we could sort of disentangle the differences based off of this data. And sort of an interesting quirk of these negotiation exercises is that the people who were taking on these roles were given this private information that there was sort of an outside offer that they had if this negotiation didn't go through, and they were told how good or bad this outside offer was. And so for some people, they were told, you have this really good outside offer, and so you can try to get as good as you can here, but there is sort of this good outside offer for you just in case. And the other half of people were told, you have an outside offer, but it's not not a very strong one at all. Sort of, if you don't get a negotiation outcome here, then you're going to end up with this sort of bad outside offer. And what we found is that when given sort of a low outside offer, men and women actually negotiated for the same general outcome. So it wasn't that men or women did better or worse than each other when they had sort of this low outside offer. The idea being that if you really need this job, if you really need, this negotiation outcome to be good, you're not going to sort of push or try to push for anything higher than maybe the minimum. However, when the outside offer was sort of strong or a good one, then we actually found this pervasive gender difference in negotiations where men ended up with sort of better negotiation outcomes than women did. And in particular, women with strong outside offers seem to be much more likely to end up in an impasse, in a no deal. And we sort of reasoned that one of the reasons why this might be the case is that it seemed like men and women were both negotiating more assertively when they had this stronger outside offer because they had the power to do so. But there was this backlash against women for actually negotiating more assertively in this specific situation. And we ran some follow-up sort of data collection to figure out that men and women went into the negotiation with the exact same expectations. So they both had the same, there was no difference for men and women in terms of what they wanted to get out of this negotiation, what they thought they could get out of this negotiation. So that sort of further shows that there didn't seem to be differences in sort of the level of assertiveness or the expectations around the outcome for men versus women. It really did seem to be that there was this backlash effect inherent there.
That is so interesting. Any thoughts from Hannah? Let's start with you. Any thoughts you would like to add? And I would love to have you also add, Julian's study didn't talk about it, but the whole thing about, women don't step up to negotiate as much as men.
Right. So I'd love to exactly build kind of right there. And I also want to make sure, so we're talking about the tough part, but we're going to get to the good part. And I know I got a comment from Elsie in here saying, how can I mitigate the backlash scenario? I'm going into a salary negotiation tomorrow.
Oh no.
So we're going to get there. And Elsie, you're going to walk in with advice from us that's evidence-based. So, but let me get to unpacking first the diagnosis. So what are the kind of challenges out there? So the really important insight, I think, from this research that Julian was just describing is that, this idea that you have a strong outside offer and that somebody's going to resist you by actually not coming to a deal, by actually risking just saying, no way, if you're pushing, that's actually that's a really important insight. So I want to back up again. As you listen to this is the hard part. So get up on the balcony and say, all right, if you think you're in this situation, you got to get up on the balcony and come up with a strategy, right? The earlier research, which was trying to explain why women are less likely to attempt to negotiate pay, is because it showed that part of the reason was that they anticipated resistance. They anticipated social resistance, and other types of resistance, as Julian's describing. But the first research showing why women were less likely than men to assert themselves in self-advocating for higher pay was that was anticipated social backlash. And that in particular, and when we ran a series of studies showing that wasn't just in their heads, that with numerous samples and multiple labs have replicated it, that, when men and women self-assert for higher pay, as opposed to just let the opportunity to negotiate pass, there's more of a cost for women. And by a cost, we compare how willing would you be to work with this person if they did versus didn't negotiate, and repeatedly we were finding, men can overdo it too, but the kind of drop in the willingness to work with the women was greater comparing the scenarios where the same woman had attempted to negotiate for higher pay versus a random sample of people who had who saw her just let the opportunity pass. So that's really important, that the anticipated backlash, the sense that this is a little socially awkward for me, is not a weakness on the part of women or an inability to negotiate. It's actually social savvy. I think what the newer research has shown is that it's not just that social resistance, but like Julian describes, there's evidence from field studies as well showing that women may also run into more what we call material resistance. They may get more resistance to the substance of what they're asking for. So should we pause there before I get into the what do you do about this and talk a little bit more about the diagnosis, or should I jump in?
I don't know, either way.
Okay, well, let me just say then. I mean, I think Julia and I are also going to talk about what's really important is not just negotiating on salary, but just focusing on salary in particular. One thing that we found is that women can, and we put a lot of work actually into this. When we first went in, we thought, well, if you just have a strong outside offer, people should just go along with what you're asking for, which is exactly the study that Julian showed doesn't work. And we tried it numerous times and we couldn't. The backlash effect kept happening. So what we figured out, running through numerous scenarios, both looking at the research, but then also going to negotiation coaches and professional coaches saying, what kind of advice do you give people? And what it came down to was doing two things. One was explaining from the perspective of the other person, why it is legitimate that you are negotiating. So in terms that they can explain, this is appropriate, justified, that I should be asking. And second, that you are taking on their perspective, that you are, this isn't all about you, this is, you're thinking about that. So one, we have numerous examples of this from executives as well as from our labs. But so for instance, one scenario might be saying, well, I hope you see my propensity to negotiate as a skill I bring to the job, and if I didn't attempt to negotiate, maybe you're kind of hiring the wrong person in this job, or, this is I think the outside offer one is obviously tough, but I think you should say, I think you would want me to explain to you that, this is what I have on the table, and geez, these are all the things that I think are so great about you guys and why I'd really love to make it work with you. And maybe we can figure out together how to solve this problem. So it's the kind of 1-2. I mean, one other one I can give you also, which I think was in the chat box, of a woman who said, she found out that a guy who worked below her, second time she found out that a guy who worked below her was being paid more than she was. So you can imagine she has a lot of things she might want to share in that moment, right? But what she said she did was she went to the company and said, I know you're going to want to fix this because this is inconsistent with our company practices, right? Legitimate.
Positive.
I'm on the team, positive, right? Now, one last thing to say about this. Some people initially, when they hear us explain this, say, are you just asking people to fulfill stereotypes? But truth is, this is just good negotiating strategy. I mean, this is really classic negotiation strategy before anybody was studying gender. Legitimate explanations for what you're asking for and taking the other side's perspective. Look for those win-wins. So we feel good about that. And we have evidence that it actually does both enhance the persuasiveness of negotiation strategies and mitigate those backlash effects.
So that's so interesting. Julie, I want to go over to you, but I do want to just mention before I hand it over that so many, and I hear this all the time, so many people say we can do better, women can do better if they just learn how to negotiate. It's all on them, right? It's all on them. And some of the research, though, doesn't confirm that it's all on them, but some of the skills are so important. Julia, what would you love to add to the conversation?
Yes, a few things. So first of all, I just wanted to add to some of Hannah's comments about this notion of sort of how you frame the ask and how you frame the negotiation, how important that is. And I have some new findings. We're in the process of publishing them where we really compare different negotiation strategies. And we really find that when people use sort of a polite but assertive strategy, we're not finding the typical backlash effects when people use a more aggressive a self-focused strategy. So I think there is a fair amount of data to support, that the framing is very important. And so I think that's really, important point as well. In terms of the employer side, and I know there was a question about this in the chat, I do think it is important to think about the employer side, to think about the other party as well. There's actually some new research found, there was some data out of Australia, an archival data set, where what they basically found was they didn't actually find a gender difference in terms of whether men and women were asking for raises. What they found was that they were asking at an equal rate, but the men were simply more likely to get the raises. So I think we also need to think about what as employers we're offering men versus women. I found in some of my research that employers are more likely to offer men higher salaries compared to women because they assume that men are their family's breadwinners. And when they get information that in fact the women are also financially supporting their families, that wage discrimination disappears. So it is really important to also think about the types of offers we're making and how from the employer side we're negotiating as well. I know there were also several comments in the chat related to this issue of pay transparency and how to get information about pay. And that is a really important point as well. I think, to the extent that you can do as much research as possible. I know there are a lot of websites now, et cetera. Certainly, I would tap into those. Another important thing to do is really to tap into your professional networks about pay. Sometimes it's uncomfortable to ask somebody, how much are you earning? So you could say, to somebody in that particular industry or company, in your opinion, how much do you think somebody in this position should earn? Or, there are ways to ask the questions where you don't need to put anyone in an uncomfortable position. And the other final comment I would make about that is be sure that you're asking both men and women what they earn. Again, women tend to ask other women what they're earning, but if women are earning less than men on average, and that's just going to perpetuate the gender gap. But again, in response to some of those comments, I do think it is really important to get as much information as possible and really specific information, because sometimes the websites are great, the salary.com and Glassdoor and all that, but sometimes they're very general and there may be regional differences and industry differences as well.
Thank you so much. We do here in Utah I still hear people saying, oh, it's a myth that there's a wage gap. It's a myth. And I'm like, okay, there's so much evidence of that, first of all. But second, just those that are listening in, we did a study. We collected data from almost 1,000 Utah women about a year and a half ago. And we're now, the study was on sexist comments and responses, how they responded. And in our second, we're going to do 5 briefs. We have 3 out. In the second one, we actually have a whole bunch on the wage gap and some of the negotiation, like comments that actually, so when people say that really doesn't happen, we have a lot of those comments to say that it does. Thank you so much. Hannah and Julia, you two, and Linda Babcock, who's well known for her work in this, published a great, and you published since then, but a great 2012 piece called A Model of When to Negotiate, Why Women Don't Ask. Yeah, do you still use that model? Can you explain that model? And if anything has changed? Julia, do you want to jump in early on this one?
Sure. Yeah, so that was, feels like ages ago, but I guess it was only
10 years.
Yes. So I guess what I would say is it's actually quite related really to the conversation that we were just having and Julian's more recent work about backlash and anticipating backlash. I think what has, so that was a model really looking at trying to really distill in mathematical terms the various parameters that would influence, whether women would ask, so to speak. And so, and including things like, issues related to their identities, how they feel in the situation, anticipating backlash, et cetera. And I think what has perhaps changed since then, again, is I think the research has gone more towards, again, these broader organizational context factors, so that it's not just, I think the research really started sort of, again, focused on this notion of, women don't ask. That was Linda Babcock's famous book, Women Don't Ask, and Women Should Ask. And I think the research has really moved from that. And I think we've moved from that to, again, this broader notion of, well, what are the organizational factors that are going to influence, whether or not women ask? So Hannah did, some really classic work showing that when there's a lot of ambiguity around is negotiation acceptable or what are the salaries, then we tend to see these gender gaps. Women are really hesitant to ask. When there's transparent information about whether negotiating is acceptable, what the salary ranges are, then we tend to see gender gaps are almost non-existent. So I would say, again, I think we've really moved from this just focus on an individual woman who sort of exists in a vacuum to thinking more broadly again, about the broader organizational context. And the other thing that's changed, and I'm sure Hannah can speak to this as well, because it's research that that we published together recently, is also moving from just thinking about, asking for, let's say, higher pay, and thinking much more broadly and richly about negotiating one's career. So, yes, starting salary matters. We all know it matters, but, it also matters to get access to a really important high level project, right? It also matters, if you can sort of negotiate a work arrangement that's going to be sustainable for you. If you're in a work arrangement that you're going to burn out of because you also need to take care of, 3, 4, 5 kids, then that's not going to work either. And so there's also been a lot of research, including ours, looking at these, broader career issues that are also really important to think of as well, because of course, pay and career go hand in hand. So, so those would be my thoughts, but Hannah, I'm sure, can chime in with some additional thoughts.
Yeah, I'll just build on that. I mean, I think to Julia's point, it's not only been negotiation research, but also the conversation about the gender wage gap has really evolved. So if you look at the leading economists of the gender wage gap, I think they highlight that not, the big explanatory fact. So negotiation is a factor. Negotiation is a factor. Going back though to Julia's point, I think one of the things that's really important to recognize is that like the gender wage gap isn't spread like peanut butter throughout the economy. It actually, in many, probably most positions, two, man and a woman, people doing the same work are being paid comparably. But when there is a fair amount of ambiguity about the relative contributions of people, or what the appropriate pay standards should be, or like, managers have a lot of, oh, well, I really need to give this person a bonus, or this person's going to leave a little extra, going to need extra money because, we might lose them or something like that. When there's a lot of ambiguity and a fair amount of discretion, or that's where you see the bigger gaps. So we just recently did a review showing, you're less likely to see gender differences in something like salary, which is fairly comparable, but where you see the differences are in like unusual forms of pay, in bonus, in equity, in some of these other things that are harder to compare and involve more subjective factors. So I think the ambiguity point that Julia was just hitting on is hugely, hugely important. I think the other thing, Claudia Golden is probably the leading economist of the gender wage gap, who's got a new book out called Career and Family. And in addition to looking at the gender segregation of occupation, so the stereotype, the women are the nurse, the men are the doctors, that's obviously changing, right? What she looks at is the gender wage gap within certain types of occupations, like lawyers. And what she shows is that a lot of the differences explain. Everybody's a lawyer, but your 40 or 50 hour a week lawyer is typically paid a lot less than half of what your 80 to 100 hour a week corporate lawyer is being paid. And that there are just certain professions where there's this like hockey puck payoff to work commitment, to extreme work commitment. And so part of the story is really about, to Julia's point, what I focus a lot now on, we want to get you more money. I want to get you a better job, not just a little more money in the job that you're in. I want to get you a better job. And then to Julia's point, remaining employed is really important. So those gaps, actually, even relatively short gaps, just less than a year, just months, can have an implications for your long-term earnings. But very often, I think when a lot of us step out for a little while, life is complicated and it's hard to get back in, and many years can pass. And so I think negotiating, which where Julia and I have been putting more and more of our attention about negotiating for those better roles, those critical developmental assignments, and for workloads and work arrangements that enable us to integrate work and life and thrive, is a place where we've been putting a lot of our energy. I don't want to miss out, sorry, on one other thing, and maybe Julian might want to jump in on this too, is thinking about intersectional perspectives. So also, there's growing research looking at, not only the implications of just being a woman, but are you relatively junior or are you relatively senior? If you're in a very senior position, that signals something different than if you're a more junior person. If you are a woman of color, there are stereotypes even about, there's not a ton of, I haven't seen a ton of variation actually in the gender and negotiation among women stuff, except for along the lines of, for race within the US. But if you look at race in general, what you see is that men of color have many of the, particularly from historically marginalized groups, have many of the same challenges that we've been identifying for 10 or 20 years now with regard to women. So it's not really just man, woman. It's really about kind of dominant group. And again, sorry, I'll just close on this, going back to Julia's. If you're negotiating in a very gender equitable organizational environment, that's different than if you're a woman trying to enter a male dominated context, you know, where you don't fit a mold. Or I'll pause there. I know my there's so much to talk about here.
I know.
We have to self-manage.
You're on a good roll. And before I turn it, ask Julian to comment though, I do want to say, just because during the holidays, I get caught up, I write a lot of editorials for papers and get caught up with all of those. And there was a paper, and maybe you know this from the last Academy of Management conference in last August, that looked at resumes and had different sample groups and the different kinds of control groups and so forth. But they looked at women returning and taking the years off, instead of how many years, instead of I did this from 2014 to 2018, but instead said for 4 years, I did this for 3 years. And actually they found some striking results, even for men. And those kinds of resumes where you don't show your career breaks, actually you just say what you've done. Anyway, just wanted to throw that out there.
I think that's extremely important. And going back to this, I mean, so part of one of the biggest twists, again, intersectional perspectives on the women don't ask, is that had we actually started out looking at negotiating for flexible work, the book might have been Men Don't Ask. Because it's difficult, there's the masculine stereotype of the competitive male breadwinner. And so that creates this pinch for women when they're self-advocating. But there's also growing evidence that men have challenges. And what made me think of it was some of the research showing that gaps in women's resumes tend to be attributed to caregiving, but gaps in men's resumes actually can be even more of a liability, which is interesting. I mean, we're getting more complicated, but hopefully also more useful in our advice we can give.
Absolutely, because you could just assume a man was being a bum or something.
That's unfortunately, yeah, we need to work on our stereotypes about who are the caregivers,
Right. And we also really need to rethink caregiving. So as Susan mentioned, I actually have a book coming out next month called The Caregiving Ambition, what it is and why it matters at home and work. And exactly, I mean, we undervalue caregiving, we overvalue work. And this has all sorts of ramifications for both men and women in the workplace, not just for women. And certainly when you really break down many of these gender gaps we see, as Hannah mentioned, they really boil down to caregiving gaps. And by the way, we always talk about, how much women earn relative to men. We rarely talk about how much caregiving men do relative to women, which is another really interesting point to make. So I don't want to interrupt the conversation, but I think it's an incredibly important issue. And in some ways we skirt it, we kind of dance around it and we don't really discuss, the extent to which it really is at the heart of so many issues. But I do think some of the new research looking at negotiating things like flexible work and scheduling, not just salary, are really a great step forward in that domain.
Thank you. And Julian, we're back to you. I'd love to hear your comments. And then I think we'll pause there and just warning you ahead of time. Let's just bring in some questions from the chat and the Q&A. Julian.
Great. So yeah, this has been incredibly interesting just to listen to. I mean, I think I just want to underline something that both Julian and Hannah mentioned, which is, I think people often think of job negotiation as being synonymous with salary negotiation. And as both of them were saying, that's definitely not the case. There's so many other things that you want to keep in mind in terms of like crafting your job, crafting your career. And in many ways, in some ways, salary negotiations are the easiest because there's a clear number involved. You can give a number, you can get a number, you can argue over a number. But in other ways, it's a very difficult one to negotiate because there is this sort of push and pull of, the more I'm asking, the more you have to give up. It's sometimes called zero sum in negotiations, right? Like if I ask for $1,000 more, that's $1,000 that you have to then give up as an employer. Whereas I think thinking about negotiations as more of a problem solving sort of situation can really be helpful, both for feeling more comfortable negotiating in the first place, but also for sort of coming to an outcome that will be beneficial both to you and to sort of the other party. And in doing so, thinking about sort of what is going to be helpful, not just for me, but for everyone involved. And so if that's negotiating sort of for a role that you feel best suited for, that's going to help you, that's going to make sure that you are doing your best work, and it's going to help the company. And so thinking about these sort of mutually beneficial situations when you're negotiating is going to hopefully make you feel more comfortable with negotiating, because it's helping everyone, and it's actually going to be beneficial to you as well. And so definitely salary is important, and you should sort of be negotiating salary. And like Julie was saying, doing your research and understanding sort of what type of salary you'd want to ask for, and looking both to sort of salaries for men and women in that area, like Julie was saying, is incredibly important, but also just thinking beyond sort of the narrow scope and what you can do to negotiate the job more broadly is going to be really helpful.
Thank you so much. And I do want to highlight something, especially I've heard this so much in Utah, that I've heard people say, men and women, well, women just aren't as good at negotiating. Now, your point is I mean, and Hannah, you mentioned this before. I mean, I have 4 kids. Do you think I'm not good at negotiation? And years, I lived in Highland, Utah for years, and my neighbor behind my house, she had twins. They were both autistic. For 15 years, they were our neighbors. And she was as good of a negotiator with school districts to get her 2 boys. So this notion of maybe women aren't good at, and Julian, your comment about negotiation for a job. I mean, we negotiate all the time, and women can be, well, we are, I think, exceptionally good negotiator. I just want to put that out there. Yeah, you're muted.
I muted myself. Sorry. I was can I please jump in on that, because you are making such a really important point. And I think going back to understanding context, right? There is a pinch that we have identified in the literature, and that is, that is particularly self-advocacy, and then specifically self-advocacy around pay, because pay is very masculine stereotypic, even though it's not really reflective of the structure of families these days. We still associate men with the breadwinner, men with the higher paying jobs, right? And so if you just simply flip it, that the woman is negotiating not on behalf of herself, but behalf of somebody else for that pay, right? We love when women are fierce advocates for others. We think it's fabulous, right? And actually, we have done some research, and other people have replicated this, that if you just simply shift whether a woman is advocating for herself or for somebody else, has a significant effect on her assertiveness and her performance. And it also reduces backlash. In fact, people are disappointed when women aren't fierce negotiators on behalf of others as opposed to themselves. That's some research by Kathy Tinsley and Emily Amanatullah. So it's just really, I mean, this is so important to think about context. It's really, really important not to just look at this pay negotiation pinch and then generalize, women think negotiation is like going to the dentist, and men think it's like a sports match. No way. Women are fabulous negotiators. What we need to be aware of is, you know what, this is a context in which gendered expectations get activated, and we need to kind of work around them, because not everybody's on the balcony kind of aware of that. Some people are, and I don't also think that backlash is necessarily intentional. I think people just grow up in an environment, they're exposed to these norms, and they just, we could overcome this. Anyways, more and more examples, more shows like yours. We got to, celebrating women as negotiators. That's what we need to recognize.
I love it. And I don't know if you're fans, but I really did appreciate, for those who are looking for some skills, even though we're talking about different things, my favorite, I went through the AAUW negotiation training, and I found that to be really high quality and have some skills that would be useful for men too. And so it's free. If you want to just get on AAUW, American Association of University Women is what it stands for. And I believe there's two. There's one for women just right out of college and one for women to be promoted. And it seems like they're just an hour, but I learned some good things. All right. Right now on my screen, I am seeing 22 Q&As and 57 chats. So I haven't been able to keep up. I'm hoping the three of you are watching. Which question should we just jump in? Who wants to jump in that you've seen a question and provide an answer? Julie?
Sure. Sure, I can jump in. There have been so many good questions. In terms of, I was thinking of perhaps addressing the question from Brooke, basically what do you recommend for women to prepare? Because I think that covers a fair amount of territory. So maybe I'll jump in with that one. I definitely would, again, return to this notion of doing as much research as possible. But I can also relate to, there was also a comment in the chat about what do you do if you've gotten the data, but either the data is not up to date, or I know people who have gotten the data and then literally been told outright, well, that data is no longer, that's not relevant. And they're just given something, they're actually given a lower offer. I mean, I've heard of all sorts of ways, in which that, when you try to use information, it's not always the most successful, but I still,
Julia,
yeah,
real quick, when you talk about data, are you talking specifically about general ranges that people get paid, or are you talking about other things too?
That's a great point. So I was mostly had in mind salary ranges, but I think what your point implies, and I think you're absolutely right, is thinking also about the offer as a whole, in addition to, just the salary ranges, as we've been discussing about thinking about job offers more holistically as well. So I would try to do as much research as possible with the numbers, but I certainly would be prepared for those types of pushbacks, because I know they happen, right? Where, oh, that information's not accurate, or, oh, that's not what we're, and really trying to think about how to address that information in real time. And that speaks to something else, which is, I would say, really, if you can really practice these situations, if you can do a mock discussion, a mock negotiation with your friend or your sister, your mom, or a colleague, but the extent to which you can go into these situations with some preparation and some scripts, I think is extremely helpful, because I think sometimes people go into these situations, they haven't really prepared, they don't really know what to say, and then all of a sudden we get really surprised because the recruiter or the hiring manager throws out something that didn't even occur to us. So that also speaks to, I think, the point Hannah made quite a bit about, is also trying to think about the other side, what's important to them, what matters to them, how what you bring to the table is also going to be a fit with what the other side needs. And Julian mentioned this as well, thinking about negotiation in terms of problem solving together, as opposed to something that we're going to get really defensive about and fight it out. The other thing I would say regarding preparation, I did publish a paper a few years ago where we tested some psychological strategies of sort of how to psych oneself up a bit. We found that what was really helpful for women was, one, actually imagining that you're going to negotiate for a friend, even though it's for yourself, right before you go into the meeting. And the second thing that we found psychologically was to sort of think back to times in the past where you have behaved assertively, you behaved, you've advocated for yourself, and also do that right before the meeting, just kind of give yourself a mental reminder about that you can behave this way. One final point, and then I'll turn it over to the other panelists. I'm sure they have a lot to say about this, is, sometimes there isn't that much room to negotiate salary, depending on the industry. Some industries have very, very strict, you come in at a certain level and there isn't actually that much room for negotiation. So, you want to try to learn about that ahead of time and don't feel like, well, if this didn't work out, well, this is like a total failure. I mean, sometimes you just simply, you don't have that wiggle room to negotiate. But you may also want to think about, okay, if the salary, there's not much room to negotiate there, but perhaps, again, you want to negotiate things like a flexible schedule, you want to negotiate things, other issues. And the other thing too, is you can always leave your options open, meaning if you're in a situation, you feel very anxious, very uncomfortable, you're not sure how to respond, you can always say, let me think about that and get back to you, right? We don't need to necessarily respond in the moment. And B, again, think about, are there other issues perhaps other than salary or that are important to you? And then C, you can always ask if, we could revisit the issue, could we revisit this issue, a year from now, something like that. Because I know a lot of the comments in the chat have spoken to, or sort of, these can be very difficult situations, right? We can be very, dealing with difficult people. So don't feel like it's sort of like, everything's over if this one meeting doesn't go well. Try to leave the door open perhaps for future discussions as well if you feel sort of unsatisfied with what you've been able to obtain.
I love the point that you made, Julia, about, we do think of just the salary and then it's win-loss, right? Either I won or I lost. But if we get flexible work schedules in a different way, that's a win. There's various wins.
Yeah, no, I think there are various wins and trying to keep those in mind as well. And then again, trying to keep in mind this notion that we can revisit issues. Can we revisit this in 6 months? Can we revisit this in a year? There are other opportunities to negotiate. I mean, obviously that initial meeting is important, but as Hannah and I have discovered in our research, people negotiate throughout their careers, and there are often many opportunities to negotiate that are just as important, if not more so, than that initial salary number.
Thank you. Julian, do you want to jump in with either comments about what Julia was talking about or hit one of those 59 questions?
Yeah, I mean, two things to emphasize about what Julia was talking about. The first is this idea about actually doing a mock negotiation ahead of time. I think this really is sort of one of the best things you can do to prepare for a negotiation, because preparation is important, and you can sort of think through all you want about what types of questions you might be getting and how you might answer, but it's a very different situation to actually be sitting there and getting the question and having to actually sort of answer it in real time. And so I think, like Julie was saying, having someone sort of play the role of the other party is going to get you in that mindset and give you sort of these habits that are really good. And what you should be doing is you should be asking your partner in this sort of mock negotiation to be as difficult as they can with you, basically, to ask as difficult questions as they possibly can. And if you leave a real negotiation setting and the hardest time you had was during the practice, then you know that you did really good preparation, because the sort of worst thing you could have gotten, you didn't actually end up getting in the real negotiation. And so that's how sort of the mindset I think you should be in these practice sessions of like, this should be the most difficult part, ideally, of the negotiation, sort of if you do this right. So that's the first thing. And then the second, yes.
Julian, real quick, do you have your students actually just practice, in coursework, and do they say it's easier when they get out? And
yeah, so that's a pretty standard in a lot of negotiation classes. That's sort of what the course is based around, is these negotiation exercises where you actually get put into many roles. So I think in my course, they do 8 or 9 different negotiations, ranging from 1 versus 1 to sort of 6 different parties, all with different things that they want out of the negotiation. And the actual, you can talk all you want about what you would do, but when you're actually sort of playing this role, it really does put you in a different mindset. And the other thing is it allows you to sort of take a few risks in a relatively low stakes situation. So if you try something like, that you're not normally comfortable with, and you're doing this in a practice situation and it doesn't end up working, that's a good time to know. You don't want to learn that sort of in a situation where it really sort of has high stakes and really matters. And so setting up sort of these practice sessions, especially when you have a specific negotiation that you want to practice for, can be really sort of helpful for a number of different reasons.
And you were going to mention another pick up another question, I think.
Yes. Well, there were a few questions earlier on that I just wanted to clarify. I think there were some questions when I was describing the study that I ran around whether there were differences between whether the other party, negotiation party, was a man or a woman in terms of this backlash. And this is kind of there's kind of conflicting results, I think, in the literature. And I think Julia and Hannah probably also would have something to say about this, but in our particular data, we did not find any differences in terms of whether the other party was a man or a woman. In both cases, you still found this backlash against sort of women negotiators who have a strong alternative. I know that's not always the case. I think some other studies have found differences in whether it's a man or a woman on the other side. And so I don't want to make too strong of a sort of claim about that, but that's just sort of to answer that question in particular.
Thank you so much. And some folks have asked if this is, we are recording this event, and we will send the link if you RSVP'd for this event. We'll send you a follow-up email in a couple of days when we get that link on our YouTube. And also we will send the title of their books and maybe some of the links to the articles and whatever else, if you have other, Hannah, Julian, and Julia, if you have other resources you think, you can send those to us, and we'll just shoot those out to all the folks. So Hannah,
well, I was, I was thinking exactly that. I was writing down, I'm really excited. I think all of us should share of the resources that we have. I appreciate also just building on Julian's point. There was a call out for HKS executive education, but I think that is a good idea to look for these classes, whether it's the AAUW or whether it's an opportunity to sit with the peers or do something like that. I do think that, to Julian's point, these people just very often describe these types of training programs as very meaningful. And also what I love about the AAUW, is less the case now that it's remote, but when they ran them in person, it was women working with women, supporting one another and I think that's a part of what goes on in the classes. And I think that's part of what's been my experience actually in executive education, that the peer-to-peer work that women do in women's leadership development is just so profoundly important. And some of it's the identity and the insight and the perspective, but also a lot of information sharing. So I want to go back to, I will put also actually related to that, I'll put in there, I've got a workbook for preparing for these types of negotiations. So I'll put a link in there for that type of thing that picks up on a lot of the tips that have already been shared. But one of the things, going back to this, some of the research that Julia was mentioning, is this, and it reflected in some of the questions, what if you don't know what the right standard is? Like, what if you don't have the information? And I think it's really important, particularly in these historic times, to not think you need the answer or the standard going into these things. I mean, to some extent, negotiation is a process of figuring things out together with other people, right? And so if you can't find the answer or the standard, you could go around and say, well, I don't know what the standard is, but here are some different points that I've found. Like, let me show you what I'm finding in my research. And you could put out a range of standards, The other thing, that one of the things that we found in the research with Julia was that, and we didn't actually discover this until blind coding, but that women were more likely than men in their negotiations to do what we call bending. That is, they weren't just asking for something standard, they were actually proposing some sort of exceptional arrangement. Now, part of that sometimes had to do with work-life stuff that women, particularly at senior levels, were dealing with that men just who had preceded them hadn't. But the other very common example was negotiating their way into roles for which they were not traditionally qualified. So they didn't fit that stereotypical characteristics of a candidate for this position, but they were using their negotiation skills, their problem-solving skills to say, listen, well, I may not be an engineer, but I have cross-functional experience, I have international experience, I know I've run these, XYZ teams, I know the system inside out, you should give me a shot at this. Like, why don't we try me out for a year and then we can make it, they would come up with these really wonderful problem-solving negotiations. So I would say critical, you don't have to have the three sources of ambiguity are about who, right? So who your counterpart is and what they know about you, right? So what do you want them to know about you walking in? Ambiguity about what are the potential standards? And if there aren't clear standards, make some up that could be relevant. Come in with a good argument for, we don't know what the right standard is, but here's some ideas that I have, and introduce them into the discussion. And then the how to negotiate. And that is, again, I think the best thing you can do is get that advice, whether it's from peers or from people ideally, who really know the organization or your counterpart really well. But another type of negotiation that relates to this bending, and I think there's a ton of bending going on right now in this dramatic transition that we're living through, negotiating all sorts of novel work arrangements. But one woman said, well, they're creating a position that never existed. And another set of negotiations related to shaping. And that is like, not just saying I want something that's standard or I want a special exception. It's saying, I think we should do things differently around here. And that's a multi-party negotiation. And we found myriad examples of women doing this. And it's not that same pinch that you experience with the pay, where it's, as Julian described, that, competitive zero sum, more money for me is less for you. It's about saying, I think we could do things better around here. I have a vision for how the organization could work better. I have a vision for a new market we could enter. I have a vision for a new way of doing things around here. And let me talk to you about why I think this is better for all of us. And that's a space that I think women can very comfortably inhabit and very effectively.
Thank you so much. I want to make sure that I get your expertise on a topic, and then we'll go back to the question. But I have in the state of Utah many sisters of color that I work with, and I'm trying as a white woman more and more to remember my sisters of color who have in the wage gap, we know, even more struggles often with the wage gap. Is there research around women of color and more rules or whatever, on how they might negotiate? Any thoughts about women of color specifically? Any of you who would like to jump in? Yeah.
Is it okay if I jump in? Do you guys want to? I mean, we have a new HBR.org out actually called Negotiating as a Woman of Color. And it's motivated by research by a leader in practice who's been visiting with us at the Harvard Kennedy School's Women in Public Policy program. Her name is Deepa Purushothaman, and she's about to publish a book called The First, the Few, and the Only, which is really about being actually a woman of color and an executive in an organization. And it's co-authored as a partnership with her, with Debbie Kolb, who is a longtime negotiation expert, and Valerie Purdy Greenaway, who's an African-American social psychologist at Columbia University, who actually has got deep expertise in diversity and negotiation specifically. And I think one of the biggest insights that I have from that research is just one of the things that keeps coming back. In fact, Valerie and I are looking into more deeply into research on this, and Deepa's obviously going to get a whole book around it. But the expectations that are placed on women of color that may be different, like you said, than white sisters or whatever the expression is. But very often, for instance, there are so many organizations right now who are wanting to do diversity work, and they're just looking, for instance, to women of color or people of color to carry that work within the organizations on top of everything else that they're doing.
Yes.
And another thing sometimes that happens also, sometimes they want to do that work. They believe in it. They believe the organization needs to do that work, but then it's not actually valued professionally by the organization and can impede their progress. So this little piece that we wrote is about thinking about negotiating some of those expectation challenges. And I think making sure we're being allies to one another, sharing information, recognizing when that's happening. If people are, anyways, I mean, I could go on and on about this, but I think we have to recognize for one another, are we being fairly, are we being comparably, equitably tasked? Or if somebody's being asked to do a whole bunch of stuff, are we advocating on their behalf to make sure that it's being valued, that it's being recognized?
Such a great point. We still have about 10 minutes. I need just a minute or two right at the end, but are there a couple of other questions that bring us to categories we haven't picked up on? Julie, anything you're seeing there that would be interesting and helpful?
Let me take a look. While I'm looking, there is one other thought that's been going through my head that does relate to this notion of problem solving together. And that is that So I actually wear another hat in addition to being a professor. My husband owns a business and I do quite a bit of HR work for him. And I actually do interview people and make job offers to them in that non-academic hat. And so I do sort of have this window into the employer side of these issues. It's a small business, but it's a small business in New York City. And I will say that, from the employer side of things, it is very hard to fill positions. In other words, it can be very challenging to go through the interviewing process, really find, people who are qualified, find the right candidates. And so I will say that, remember, from the employer side, when you've gotten to the step of actually making an offer, that's from the employer side, that's a long process. And so, I would say, if you're approaching the negotiation with the employer, again, with a problem-solving mindset, asserting yourself, but in a polite, thoughtful way, thinking about the other party, then that I think is very reasonable. And from the employer side, they don't want to go back to square one either, right? I mean, yes, they may have other candidates, et cetera, but if it helps in any way to assuage some of the anxiety that women tend to feel much more than men, you may also remember that as well, which is this has been a process for the employer, and they have a lot riding on this decision, a lot riding on this offer, a lot riding on fulfilling the position. Training people takes a lot of time, and when these situations don't work out, employers also really suffer from that. So I think thinking about this as a win-win is also, I think a very good approach, and also perhaps can help assuage some of that anxiety. And I just did want to respond to, there was a question about the finding I mentioned about when women are breadwinners, they get offers equal to those of men. And I think the question was like, should you just say you're the breadwinner or something like that? I don't know if I would sort of throw it out in the sense of, by the way, I'm my family's primary breadwinner, but, certainly I think, if you want to, I don't know if hint is the right word, but I think, certainly make clear that, that you are, that this, you're committed to your career and financially supporting your family. If you want to sort of send those cues, I think based on what we found in our research, that can only help you, because employers, both men and women, typically tend to make very different assumptions about working women versus working men. It's a shame that we're still at that point, given that, as Hannah mentioned, family structures have really changed. It's, this typical homemaker breadwinner, male, female, that doesn't really exist anymore, but assumptions die hard. So the extent to which you can sort of provide some cues to counter any assumptions that people may have, particularly, it sounds like in Utah, there may be a lot of really traditional assumptions going on in the workplace. I certainly would encourage you to do so, but I don't know if I'd, again, blast it out, but I would certainly send cues in that direction.
The data we've collected in Utah in that study that I mentioned, very clearly, most of the statements were about, you're not a breadwinner, I can't give you a raise, and he needs more money, very blunt. Things like that. So I know many women struggle with that. Julian, anything that you would like to answer, any thoughts? And then we'll just go quick, maybe asking you all one time for your final 30 seconds of advice. So Julian.
Yeah, so this relates to what Julia was talking about, sort of and there were a lot of questions, it looks like, asking from the employer perspective as well. And I just want to go back to something that Hannah said early on, which was this idea that the sort of context shapes these outcomes, like whether or not there's a gender gap to begin with, for example. And at the same time, the people in the organization will shape the context or shape the organization itself. And so if you do find yourself in a position where you can actually try to sort of change the rules and regulations around how things are being negotiated or what the process of onboarding or hiring looks like, I think that's also something to think about, is sort of what are the best ways you can try to sort of shape that process to make it as equitable as possible. And I don't know that there's sort of a one size fits all answer to that, but I think there are sort of things you can think about. And I know there are organizations that, for example, have said we're not negotiating on salary, right? We're giving everyone who comes in at a certain sort of level the same salary. I think there are other organizations that have gone even further and said we're not negotiating at all in the hiring process. And I think, as sort of Julia was mentioning, and as I mentioned, there's definitely benefits that can come out of negotiation, both for you and for the organization, in terms of finding the best fit for you in your role and all of these types of different things. And so saying we're not doing any negotiation is sort of like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, in a sense of it's not, it might be helping certain things, but it's maybe creating also some more harms. And so I think things like salary itself, we're going to be transparent on pay, and we're going to not, make salary negotiable, is, while we're going to negotiate some of these other things, is something that you could do to sort of get a best of both worlds. But the last thing I'll say, I know we're running out of time, is just, if that is sort of a policy that gets implemented, it has to actually be implemented and actually be consistent across the organization. You can't have a situation where you tell people we're not negotiating on salary, but then you let some people negotiate their salary, because then you're getting situations where women may be less likely to know that this is something you could actually push on, because it's something that is sort of stated in the policy. And so I think whatever policies you make around negotiation to try to sort of close the gap is something that needs to be consistent and needs to be sort of upheld for everyone.
I know there's been research that when women do know that there is a range and they have permission in some ways to negotiate, they negotiate more. So your point is so important. Hannah, any quick last thoughts, and then Julia, and then Julian?
I'll give you my 4 steps that they can keep in mind. So number 1, be clear on your goals. So people can get kind of anchored by the offers that are in front of them and get all focused on pay and lose sight of actually realizing that something else is more important to them. So be clear in your goals, stay in touch with your goals. Second thing is also, it's really good to know what you have, an understanding of what you're asking for. Are you asking for something standard? Are you asking for something exceptional? Are you trying to change the way things are done within, proposing something entirely new? Because that's going to require different types of arguments, right? The third thing, I think we keep saying this, reduce ambiguity, about who the negotiators are, what is potentially negotiable. I think, going back to Julian's point, organizations just simply making transparent what is negotiable is really important. Not necessarily everybody gets the same deal, but we can have conversations about these things. And then also, what are the norms around how to negotiate? And then finally, we have this little ditty that is, enhance your negotiations through relationships and your relationships through negotiations. And that is, tap your network for advice in your negotiations. But then when you're negotiating, take the other side's perspective. Why is what you're asking for legitimate, justified, appropriate, and why will they recognize it's in their interest?
Thank you so much. Julia.
Goodness, by the time I unmute, we're going to be done. I would really emphasize the practice and the scripting it. I just think this can be such an anxiety-inducing situation for women in particular, for so many different reasons, that, if you can practice with different people, as Julian said, have them be hard on you, have them say crazy things you never would have expected, and script it, come up with a script that works for you, that you're going to feel comfortable using, and really think through, again, the best way to present the negotiation, how to be assertive but polite. As Hannah mentioned, that should be justified in terms of the value you bring, keeping in mind, the competition, sort of have kind of a reasonable, logical view, and then just go in and go for it. And, if it works out, I hope it works out. And if it doesn't work out, then you're going to try again the next time, or you're going to revisit the conversation. It's not the end of the world either. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And Julian.
Just real quick, this is something Hannah already sort of mentioned, but understanding not just what you want out of the negotiation, but what the other party wants out of the negotiation too, and what you can do, again, to get back to this mutual problem solving sort of situation, to get a situation that, or get an outcome that is not only good for you, but something that sort of they want as well.
So thank you so much to the panelists, and also to those of you that have joined today. We'd like to thank our sponsors again, UEN, the John M. Huntsman School of Business, and USU Extension. So thanks again for joining, and a special thanks to our 3 guests. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Susan.
Yeah. Thank you.
Have a wonderful day.